Hey guys, let's build a lizard. So most builds start out with a key part that I base everything else around, which in this case is a very key part. Get it? Yeah, it's a key. For this lizard, I'm actually going to use two of these keys. One will be used for the body later down the line, but for now, let's start working on the head. Obviously, the key isn't exactly a perfect lizard head shape, but with a little bit of alteration it will be. I'm just using my Dremel to chop the key bit of the key off. It's not exactly the smoothest job I've ever done, so I started rounding it off with the Dremel, trying my best not to burn myself, which is a task that I will inevitably fail at during this video. I actually had a bit more material I wanted to remove, so went over to my sander just to speed things up a bit. Okay, so you might be starting to see a lizardy head shape coming together, or you might have no idea what I'm talking about. Maybe seeing the two keys together might help, one for the head and one for the tail section. But before I get ahead of myself working on the body, I need to build up a bit more structure and get this head looking more 3D than it is right now. I've got a few of these drawer pegs that I appropriated from some broken furniture I found abandoned in the street a few years ago. And together with a couple of nuts, it will be a good way to get some height to the head before I sort of layer on some skin in the form of these brass picture frame hangers. I was about to weld the nuts together, but I realised that one of them was actually slightly smaller than the other one, so swapped it out for a matching pair. I did a little test weld to check everything sat right before committing to that alignment, as it's very difficult to change your mind once something's been properly welded in place. This is a lesson I've been taught the hard way, and one it could be argued I still haven't quite learned. With that sorted and strong, I went to weld the peg onto the head base. Ironically, I did not check this was right at all before happily welding every available inch of it in place. When I then did check it fit with the welded nuts, I realised it was, of course, not in the right place at all. Luckily, this was a fairly weak joint and easy enough to break. I'd placed it too far back the first time round and needed to move it further forward, but this positioning means that the rim in the middle wouldn't slot into the keyhole, so I need to flatten that out first. Apparently I thought just holding it in my fingers was the most sensible way to do this, which it clearly wasn't. After engaging some of my higher brain functions and decision making pathways, I grabbed a pair of pliers that made things way easier. With the pegs suitably flattened, I had a good surface to weld to. Unfortunately, during this process, I forgot to hit record on my primary camera, so we're left with this awful contrast, bright spot until I remembered to turn it back on. Don't worry, it's not long, I promise. I checked the nuts fit in properly next to the peg, and happy now that the position worked, went about reinforcing the weld before adding in the nuts as well. The key, peg, and nuts serve as the skull, so it's time to get some skin on. I welded the tip of the brass hinge shut so it wouldn't splay open later and made sure it looked good on the head before welding it in place. I promise we are so almost done with this terrible camera angle. Now this is looking good, but I still want a bit more structure on the sides, as well as a way to attach the eyes later. So I'm taking a couple of small nails and bending a kink in the middle before welding it to the head at both ends. Now when it comes to the second nail, I've got to try and get this as symmetrical as possible. Something that if you've seen my other videos, you'll know I pretty regularly never get right first time. This was no exception, so I removed both the nails and started work on round 2. Luckily this prompted me to check my phone and realise the camera wasn't on, so you guys get to see something half decent again. Once I'd bent the nail into a shape that I thought was right, I went back and welded it in place. I tried my best to repeat this, bending the nail in the same spot and the same angle. But as I started welding, it became pretty obvious I got this wrong again. I took the nail off and had to remove some of the weld with my Dremel to get a clean surface to try again. This was actually looking pretty good, and that combined with the fact that I've been doing this for about an hour meant I went ahead and just welded it properly in place, essentially forcing myself to live with my choices because at this point trying to remove the nails again would be way too much work. That being said, it still wasn't perfect, and the point of one of the nails was sticking out a bit too far, so I took my Dremel and ground down the front of the face so everything looked neat. Hopefully, now you're starting to see a lizardy shape taking place. I love how you can take a key, peg, hinge, as well as a couple of nuts and nails and start to get like a hint of an organic shape forming. Or you think this looks like a lump of metal and I'm talking nonsense. Either way, I need to build up the back of the head a bit now, and I'm going to use another one of the hinges to do that. I need to cut it down to a size so that it fits. I butchered this first time round and made it too short, but did much better on my second attempt. I bent the ends down with some pliers and this seemed to work pretty well. I sanded down the cut edge off camera so that it was smooth and straight. I made a few little adjustments with the pliers to make sure the bend was exactly how I wanted it, and then went in with the welder to seal it sharp, making sure the edges wouldn't separate over time. With one final check to make sure everything looked good, I started welding it to the head. This will also give the lizard a neck of sorts and allow me to move the head up and down in different positions, which is always fun. Now, watching this video back while editing, I thought this looked pretty good. Couldn't see anything wrong here. But apparently at the time I did, as I snapped that part off for some reason and used some super glue to secure it in what I assume was the perfect place. Seemingly happy with this and the super glue holding it there, I went in with the welder to properly join it to the head. Still haven't got a clue what I didn't like, because this looks identical to me, so let me know if you can spot what I changed, as so far I'm stumped. With the top of the head done, it was time to add on the lower jaw. For this, I'm using another hinge. God only knows what I'll do when I run out of these parts. And again, I'm just welding the tip so it doesn't separate. The jaws are really simple, it's just a hinge and a couple of small nails to give it a bit more structure. I bent the first nail and welded it in place before trying to recreate the same angles on the other side. If you bet that I wouldn't do this first time, then congrats, you're starting to figure out how things work around here. This looked good, but the nails pushed the jaw a little bit further out than I like, so I sanded them down a tiny bit so they'd fit more flush against the head. Once I got in an angle I was happy with, I weakly welded it in place, just so I could check things before committing. Maybe a bit too weakly, because dropping it broke the piece off instantly, but I got it reattached without too much trouble. Happy with everything, I gave it a once over just to make sure all the welds were strong and drop proof for the future. I was really happy with the head at this point, but still had my favourite step to go, adding the eyes. The eyes are always tricky. People really pay attention to them, so they're one of the most important things to get right. I want to use some black screws for them, but I need the perfect screw head to give them the right look. I'm combing through my collection here and trying out a few different sizes and styles, seeing how they'd look. With a pair I liked, I chopped the end off so that I could better see how it would look on the head, and was pretty happy with this, so went over to modify it fully. I thought I could do this in my vise, but I had a feeling the second I tried it would go flying and be lost forever, so switched to a pair of pliers instead. Although even these didn't hold it very well, as it started twisting as soon as I used the Dremel on it. I found a better way to hold it and went back in with the Dremel, trying my best not to grind away the actual pliers. Once this had sort of cooled down, I could see it was nice and flat and repeated the process on the second eye. Now I needed to weld them on. This turned out to be a bit tricky, as welding through the microscope I couldn't see if they were in the right position or had shifted at all. So I grabbed my trusty super glue and used just a tiny dab of that to get the eye into the perfect position and then weld it in place. This looked good, so I repeated it on the other side. I love how adding the eyes makes such a difference, and you really start to see the animal taking shape. The bottom jaw looked a little bit bare, so I threw in a small washer just to give it a bit more structure. This step was probably unnecessary, seeing as no one will really see the underside, but it just felt right to do. Now the head is basically done, but there's another piece I wanted to add to the top of the head to make it look a bit more interesting. I thought that I had a few of the parts I had in mind organised in these boxes, but that turned out to be wishful thinking. This unfortunately meant I was going to have to go searching through one of my to-do boxes, which is never fun because there's actually zero guarantee the part I want is going to be in there. I could tell I was on the right track as I found a couple of parts that fit the bill, but they weren't quite the size or shape I was looking for. After 15 minutes of my life that I'll never get back, I managed to find the perfect one. I squashed it flat, well, as flat as I could at least, and started trying to bend it to fit the shape of the head. This turned out to be harder than I thought and took me a lot more attempts than I'm willing to show here. Once I had it close enough, I welded it onto the head. It's a tiny detail, but I feel like those are the things that make a huge difference when you're working on a small scale like here. With the head done, it's time to work on the body. Now, the base part for the body is going to be built around one of these, a magnetic badge holder. I ended up with a load of these when I worked as a sales assistant at Harrods years ago and realised they'd be great for making sticky lizards. So conveniently lost my badge magnet enough times to build up a steady supply of replacements. Between the magnet and the tail key, that's basically the entire body plan, so I just need to make it 3D. To attach the head, I need a nut to raise it up a bit, but I wasn't totally sure where to attach this yet, so just super glued it in place for now. These two bolts will give the body some of the height and structure it needs and throw in a bit of colour variation so it doesn't all look too silver. I welded them together and checked to make sure that I had space for the key making up the tail once everything was joined. With the placement lined up, I snapped the bolt off so that I had space to work welding the bolts in place. With those on, welding the key was next. I used small nails on the underside to make this connection a bit stronger as I couldn't actually get a great weld between the edges where the magnet and the key met. With two of those added in, the whole thing was feeling pretty strong and I liked how it was looking with the head. I needed to remove the super glue residue so that I could weld a fresh nut in place to attach the head later. I wanted this to be really strongly attached as it would serve as most of the strength when moving the head around. I also didn't want the head completely straight on, and felt like an angle would give it a bit more of a natural, lifelike feel to the build. However, welding it at the angle I'd picked was making it pretty difficult to attach, and I just kept messing it up. Sometimes I think about cutting these mistakes and struggles out of the videos, but I don't want you guys to think that I just whip these sculptures up no problem. This is probably the 6th lizard I've made, and I still don't get it right first time. So if you look at stuff I built and think, oh, I couldn't do that, honestly, neither can I. Not at first at least, but what you and I can do is just keep trying until we get it right. Eventually, I did manage that, and made sure it was properly attached before admiring my work. I want to throw a bit more of the gold colour components on the lower body, and this little ring should look good, but it doesn't actually fit on properly because this nub on the key that sticks out. Luckily, Dremels were invented specifically for things like this, and it was pretty easy to grind it down so that everything fit nice and snug. With that sorted, it was easy enough to weld in place, although I felt it needed a bit more strength, so threaded some little nails in just to give some more points of connection. And obviously, I made sure to check that those points of connection were really, really hot. Oh yeah! When I went to lay the lizard down on my mat, I realised I'd made a mistake. The ring stuck out further than the bottom of the magnet, so it wouldn't be able to stick to anything with that in the way. I had an idea how to fix this, but it was going to need to be really strong to survive the process, so I went a little overkill, adding more nails and structure in just to hopefully keep it all together. I figured I could just sand it down, and this actually worked so much better than I expected. It weirdly almost flattened the metal once it got thin enough, whereas I'd assumed it would just remove that section entirely. The universe seemed to think I deserved something breaking and lashed out at my set of drawers for some reason, but other than that, it went really well. This was looking good as a little skeleton for the lizard, but similarly to the head earlier, I needed to give this guy some skin. I have quite a lot of this type of metal from taking things apart, and it always comes in interesting shapes. It also helps that it welds really well, and it's very malleable. It's my go-to for adding skin to things, so you'll see it crop up in a lot of my sculptures. I tried out a few different pieces until I found one that was a good size and shape. I wanted it to be raised up a little better once I attached it, and figured I could use a nail to create a bit of a ridge at the end. I welded it on and checked that fit right. To which it didn't, because I'd welded it to completely the wrong end, so tore it off and got it welded the correct end this time. And then cleaned the edges up a little with my Dremel and sander. Once I was done, it looked pretty subtle and I started attaching it to the body. I didn't want to weld it directly to the golden parts as it would discolour them, so instead used some little nails to bridge the gap, throwing a couple in on each side. Once they were attached, I could snip them down to size and neaten up the connections so that they weren't super obvious. I also quite liked that it meant you could still see the inside of the lizard, almost like its metal organs. I would, however, later find out that adding these on was a mistake and gets in the way of other parts that I need to add on, but for now, I'm blissfully unaware. I also added some supports to the neck so that it was a bit stronger, as there wasn't much keeping it attached at the time. I used little nail sections here again because I didn't want to overcomplicate the design or make the neck section too bulky by adding larger parts in. This required lots and lots of trimming and modifying to get the perfect size, which sometimes was absolutely tiny and meant I dropped and lost more than a couple of sections. This was getting so irritating that I had to sandwich some blue tack between the tweezers to try and stop them from slipping out. Which didn't actually help very much, and I continued to just drop them and had to endure the resultant psychic damage. This all eventually worked out, and I had some fun playing around with the magnetic aspect of the lizard. This guy was still missing a tail, so I grabbed the nails and got started. This one seemed like a good size, but I couldn't get it to sit flush with the tail because of the head. This wasn't too tricky to rectify with the sander, and once it had been ground down, the tail fit really nicely in the key channel. Now, obviously if I kept the nail completely straight, it would look really unnatural, so I need to decide how to bend it to make it a bit more lifelike. Sometimes I do feel a bit silly talking about things looking unnatural or lifelike, as if there's anything natural about a lizard made out of keys and nails, but hopefully you get what I mean. I kept making little adjustments here and there until I felt like I had the perfect bends, or in this case, until I'd made so many that I no longer liked how it looked and had to completely start over with a new nail. This one was simpler and went way better, so I was ready to weld it on. The actual welding itself did not go better, and I was treated to one of the more painful burns in this video.
Ouch.
With a bit more care, I was able to get it attached and kept my fingers away from the hot zone as I made sure it was really locked in. With the tail on now, I'd say this guy was looking pretty lizardy, and I was really liking the progress. Apparently a bit too much, as I was quickly punished for admiring my work by burning myself on what turned out to be a tail that was still very hot. That burn was enough that I called it a day there, and when I came back to the studio, I spent about 10 minutes searching for the lizard, wondering where I could possibly have put it, before realizing I'd left him stuck to my desk drawer. With lizard secured, it was time to start on the legs. But first, I need to say something about circuit boards. You guys might know by now that I'm a pretty big fan of them. They've made an appearance in some of my favourite sculptures, and will actually be the main focus in a top secret piece that I'm building right now. Well, unless you're a Patreon subscriber, in which case just don't spill the beans yet. I get all my circuit boards from taking apart old electronics, but if you're actually trying to make something that works, PCBWay, the sponsor of this video, is the place to go. With on-demand PCB prototyping and assembly, as well as advanced PCB production and CNC machining, they can cover all your printed circuit board needs at any scale. And right now, to celebrate their 11th anniversary, they're having a sale, so if you want to build something cool, visit PCBWay.com. The legs are going to have a pretty simple skeleton, a bolt and a screw making up the main bones, as it were. The first thing I want to figure out is the positioning for all of these, so I start by laying them all out. I like this, but the legs look a bit spindly, so I decided to use some nuts on the bolts to flesh them out. I welded one at each end so that I didn't completely cover up the bolt and had a bit of fun negative space that I could maybe fill with some colour later. I apparently did not think about whether this might be incredibly hot and got probably the worst burn of the video out of the way. Jesus. You'll notice that I start picking things up with tweezers for a while after this. I welded the nuts to the other bolts until I had all 4 leg sections ready. I went and checked that the thicker legs actually looked good with the body and noticed that one of the legs had been so hot it melted part of my mat, which strangely irritated me more than when it had melted part of my hand a minute ago. Now I felt like the forearms were a bit thin, which means I'm going to have to crack out something special. Whenever I make lizards, I tend to use these specific little nails. I even keep track of how many I have left on the box. They're really neat and perfect, so work really well for making the lizard toe pads, and I honestly dread the day that I run out. To make this guy, I'll need 20 of them, 5 for each limb. I'm welding 2 together just slightly at the end, and then bending them apart so they're at a slight angle before fixing them in that position. Once they're together, I can then weld them onto the screw forearms and get them properly fixed in place. I repeated this for both the arms and made sure I liked how it looked. It actually makes the limbs a bit longer as well as thicker, which I think really helps with the proportions. With all the leg sections ready, now I needed to join the 2 halves. I'm using blue tack here to secure them in position and get the perfect angles. I was thinking about welding them in situ initially, but decided I could keep the angles consistent enough to weld them directly through the microscope instead. I'm just doing a single weld to secure them in place because I want to see how they all look together before I commit to any of the angles. They looked as good as they were going to get, so I went in and just made them all really strong. Clearly I was happy with how this was looking as I started emoting for some reason. Now the angle I want for the bottom left leg means it's going to jut out awkwardly, so I've got to modify it to fit properly by cutting a channel through the middle of it. I started to cut it, but remembered I liked my thumb, and a slip here was too sketchy even for me, so got it set up in my vise instead. This actually made cutting way easier, and begs the question why I didn't try this the first time around. I checked to see if it was enough, but it still didn't fit, so I went back in to widen the groove. I don't want to take too much off here and have it loosely rattling around, so I'm going slowly and checking regularly to make sure I get a snug fit. I realised that the nails I'd added to the underside to secure the gold tail part earlier were actually blocking things and meaning I'd have to take off even more at the leg to fit. Because I didn't really want to do that, I decided the nail had played its part and went about grinding it down to create some more space. My thumb didn't get any special treatment this time and got a nice little spark massage instead. This was pretty close to fitting now, but still needed a little more taken off both the body and the leg before they finally slotted into each other nicely. Now all the legs were officially ready and you can see how the piece is going to come together. However, I felt the body looked a little bit too thin on the sides here with the thicker legs, so selected a nail to run along either flank. It was a bit too long, so I chopped it down. As I tried to fit it into place though, I realised the supports I'd added earlier were getting in the way, so needed to cut a channel in with the Dremel. It took a few attempts to get both parts to fit perfectly, as I really didn't want to overdo it and make anything too small. I was really happy with how that looked though, so went ahead and repeated the process on the other side to match. Once I had both ready, I went over to weld them in place. It was only after welding them that I realised this now blocked the shoulders and pushed the arms too far out, as well as infringing on the right leg slightly. I roughly worked out and marked where I'd need to cut with a trusty Sharpie and took it over to the shop. I hadn't actually welded these on quite as well as I should have, considered the modifications I was making, so I had to quickly go and redo that before continuing the alteration. Finally, all the limbs fit, so all they needed were some feet and they'd be ready to join the body. The feet are really simple. They're basically just 3 of these special nails arranged in a triangular shape, but to do it I need to cut 2 of the 3 down into equal sizes. Because I want these to all be the same, I stuck them down to the table and marked the cut length with a Sharpie. I cut the first one, made sure I'd actually chosen the good length before repeating that and forming the first foot to compare to the arm. Everything was looking good, so I cut the rest down to size. The last part of the foot/hand, I guess, section that I need are these little golden screw threadings that I have a load of from taking apart old laptops. Now I know for a fact that I have tons of these, but for some reason I could only find a handful here, none of which were the right size. This was really annoying me, so I got distracted looking for other pretty components. I actually gave up looking for these entirely and decided to get back to the actual toes, arranging them all to get an idea of how it would look together. These are really easy to weld, so I made pretty quick work of finishing all the feet. Now, it actually took me an entire day of going through all my boxes before I was able to find the gold parts I've been looking for, and typically they were in the last place I expected. I grabbed a nice chocolate box and gave them a new home where hopefully I would remember in future. This box actually had loads of stuff I'd forgotten about, including some tape I'd spent hours looking for a couple of weeks ago. With all the parts now accounted for, I went over and chose 4 that were the right size and laid them out ready to attach. At first I tried to weld these on, but only managed to succeed in burning myself, so turned to old reliable superglue. These would end up sandwiched between metal anyway, so didn't really need to be welded. Once I had them all ready, I trimmed the centre nail down so that I would have space to attach it to the underside of the forearm. Again, this was really easy to weld, and I just repeated the process for each leg. Now, I don't love how some of the legs were barely attached, so wanted to find a way to flesh out the knees and elbows. For this, I'm turning to my trusty bolt and screw collection. The plan here is to use the heads of some nice looking screws to form a sort of kneecap over the joint. I've got 4 pretty similar ones that should work, so now I just need to cut the heads off. This seemed like a great time to perform my newest magic trick, make that part you need disappear. I spent way longer than I'd like to admit searching for the chopped head and finally found it hiding underneath my workbench. I made sure that I cut the rest of them so nothing could go flying off. A lesson I'm sure I'll need to be retaught again someday soon. I couldn't quite cut them flush, so I had to go in with the Dremel to fully clean them up and get everything nice and flat. I think here I actually ended up grinding a not insignificant amount off my pliers, but that's the price you pay sometimes. With them cut, I started welding them in place. On the second leg, I decided I didn't like the angle, so bent it slightly before adding on the cap. Gotta be honest here, I thought this looked bad. Probably because it did, but sometimes I give myself way too much leeway with an idea and I just kept trying to make this work. It didn't work on the lower limbs, and it definitely didn't work on the upper ones, so that was the wake-up call I needed, and I removed all the ones I'd welded and came up with a better plan. These tiny screws would work way better and not get in the way of the leg shape like the others were. Unfortunately, the downside of these is they're very hard to hold with the tweezers, and I lost several of them during the process. But aside from my butterfingers, it wasn't too painful getting them added on, and pretty quickly the legs were ready to be attached. The magnets here helped out a fair bit, and they actually held the first leg in position while I welded it in place. The others didn't quite work, so I decided I could just tack weld them in place first. I'd like to say I managed to set this up without electrocuting myself, but that would be a lie. I used blue tack to fix everything in place at the angles I wanted, and tack weld each limb on one at a time, welding them properly after each tack weld. This is actually incredibly painless. If you've seen some of my other videos like the spider builds, you'll know trying to attach the legs like this can give me a ton of grief, but these ones didn't really give me any trouble. I actually love how this looks plain, with just the grey and gold styling, and had some fun playing around with the magnets. The fun did not last very long. While I said I like them plain, there is no question that this is my favourite part. Adding the colours and details really brings them to life and gives me a chance to use some of the coolest parts that I've collected from old electronics. I tried out a few colour combinations here, but really wanted to do something new, and there's one colour I've never used on a sculpture: purple. I barely managed to find any purple components over the years, and I've kind of been hoarding the ones that I do have, so decided to put them to use. This capacitator looks amazing, but it's just way too fat to stick on the body, so I figured I could cut it in half. It looks like health and safety went out the window here, because you can tell I know better than to just hold this while cutting it, but apparently I just ignored the quiet voice of reason in my head. Luckily it got way too hot to hold before I actually managed to do any real damage, so I switched to using some tweezers instead. This still wasn't quite cutting it, pardon the pun, so I got the actual pair of pliers I should have been using from the start and managed to get through without destroying anything. It wasn't exactly a clean cut and was still a bit too fat, so I used some sandpaper to clean it up and get it to the thickness I wanted. I could already tell it was going to look great, but this bit of metal stuck out right where I wanted to attach it, so I used the Dremel to grind it down so that I had a nice flat surface. A tiny bit of sanding and everything was fitting nice and flush. I repeated the sanding process on the other half and played around with a few different arrangements for both bits before settling on this. Obviously, I can't weld these parts, so just use some superglue instead. I messed this up first time round, but quickly pried it off and positioned it correctly. Now that I had my eye in, gluing the second one went way smoother, and together they served as a good base of colour, kind of the focal point of the piece. Yeah. I thought the gold and purple looked really cool, so started playing around with other components to see what else would work. I had these tiny gold pieces that I thought looked really cool, actually directly on the purple, so started gathering some more and trying a few different pattern combinations until I had something I liked. At this point, I'm kind of just throwing stuff on and seeing what sticks. I can't really just add one part at a time until it's ready because I need to see how the parts are going to look together first. So you might be confused why parts look like they're coming on and then off again, but it's just me shuffling things around to evaluate whether they add or detract when everything else is there. I also wanted to flesh out the more spindly arm sections, so threw in some of these cool black and gold components that matched everything quite nicely. I only had 3 actual proper purple resistors, so needed to use these sparingly with a couple of extra ones that were purple-ish I could use to fill in some of the gaps. By now, choosing where to put each part doesn't require too much brain power, as each lizard follows similar rules. I don't want to completely copy my previous work, so it's not like I'm following a manual, but it does cut out some of the heavy lifting. Sometimes I'll sand down parts to get them to fit better, because when I'm using superglue, which obviously isn't as strong as welding, I want to make sure that I can get good surface contact to make sure they won't go anywhere. It's a really fine line between not enough and way too much, so I'm trying to not go overboard adding every single cool part I have, which is honestly easier said than done, because I kind of love all of them. To throw in a little contrast, I thought some tiny bright pink resistors would add some good highlights to this piece, so started testing out a few different combinations for gluing them on. Adding them in just gave a really great pop of colour, and the variation actually helps the purple stand out a bit more. And then I welded the chip on because it actually had some metal contacts that would let me make sure it was really well secured. I was actually loving this colour scheme, probably more than any lizard I'd done before. It just feels really ornate, almost like jewellery or something. Now, at this point, I thought I felt like I was done, hence the litany of videos I took showing him off, but when I came back to the studio the next day, I just felt he wasn't quite right and knew what I needed to do to get it perfect. I wanted to add these resistors to the legs so that they look less skinny, but the resistors were a bit too big, so I took them over to my sander. For about the 5th time this video, I made the mistake of using my hands instead of pliers before I did some critical thinking and came to the only sensible conclusion. These all fitted lengthways now, but were being slightly blocked by the black and gold parts in the middle, so I removed them and repositioned so that just everything could fit in properly. I then did a tiny bit of welding to make sure they were secure, and he was finally finished. I'd love to know what you guys think of this piece, and importantly, what you would like to see me make next. I've got some cool builds on the go at the moment, so if you want to stay tuned for those, like, subscribe, give me your PIN number, firstborn child, all that good stuff. Huge thank you to my Patreon subscribers for supporting my work, and I'll catch you guys in the next one.